Hello again. Welcome to our third Families Value community call in our series, Courage and Community. My name is Maddie Allen, and I am the Advocacy Manager at the Center for Public Justice. We're so glad that you're here, but if you're unfamiliar with CPJ, the Center for Public Justice is a nonpartisan Christian public policy and civic engagement organization. Families Valued is a program of CPJ which promotes faith and family-friendly public policies and workplace practices that help families flourish. Just a few reminders as we're getting started today to please make sure to keep your mic off and add any questions that you have during our conversation today to the chat box. If this is your first ever time attending a community call with Families Valued, we are just so delighted to have you with us, and we want to give you a little background by discussing some of the motivating principles that underlie the work of Families Valued. So the first is that families are the foundation of healthy communities and society. The second is God's called people to work as good and healthy part of life. And then thirdly, all work, including family caregiving, has inherent dignity. CPJ believes that family relationships are a blessing from God, not only to be shared within a family, but also to extend into the wider community with their neighbors. Through policy recommendations for paid family leave and advocacy for maternal mental health and pregnancy accommodations, Families Value team pursues racial justice, supports women and family, and upholds all families and communities as worthy of care, even if they don't fit in the traditional boundaries of a nuclear family and extend all the way into neighborhoods. At its core, Families Valued is a group of Christians who gather together to work together to build a common life that supports all families. We imagine and advocate for better workplace environments and public policies for families based on what we've learned in our own lives, but also by listening to our neighbors and what's happening in their lives. Back in 2018, Families Values was officially launched and under the leadership of Rachel Anderson. And with the initial convening that gathered listeners and leaders from different Christian organizations all across America. We published a report together called Time to Flourish, which described the kinds of time crunches that take a toll on families. Husbands and wives working shifts that mean barely seeing each other, mothers feeling pressured to get back to work as soon as they've had a baby. In 2019, we created a practical guide to help Christian employers make their workplaces much more family friendly. And since then, we've advocated together for and helped win policy changes. For example, in 2023, Congress passed the Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which helped millions of women ask for healthier working conditions, leading to safer pregnancies. During the pandemic, we reached out to legislators to urge them to prioritize family support, such as specialized family leave for parents of kids doing school from home. Advocacy may sound like something limited to those working in public policy or the government, but in reality, each of us can pursue justice through engaging as citizens, advocating on behalf of our neighbors. It simply requires showing up and responding to a need, or even telling our own stories. So we gather together for these quarterly community calls to gain insights that strengthen our faith and information we can use to speak out on behalf of our own or others' families that are our neighbors. This season, we focused on the Christian practice of finding courage and community. And we are learning more about public policies that place families at the center. Pro-family tax policies like the child tax credit, and working towards paid family and sick leave policies for everyone who needs it. At some point in life, all people will experience a form of vulnerability and be in need of care. Families are first in line to help the vulnerable. As followers of Jesus, we remember that Jesus began his public ministry at a celebration of family, a wedding. Throughout his life, Jesus welcomed those who were hurting, lonely, or grieving into his circle and connected them with relationships. As Christians and citizens, we seek to work together to attend to our neighbors' needs in concrete ways, including by promoting or empowering care of all kinds. It is with these goals in mind that we are gathered here today to hear from Shannan Martin. Shannan, author of Start With Hello, The Ministry of Ordinary Places, and Falling Free, is a speaker and writer who founded her voice in the country and her story in the city. Shannan works as a cook at The Window and a local nonprofit dedicated to feeding its community. She and her family live as grateful neighbors in Goshen, Indiana. Welcome, Shannan. We're so delighted to have you with us today and discuss how to neighbor during these contentious, difficult times. So, welcome, Shannan.
Thank you so much, Maddie. It is a privilege to be here with you today on this beautiful afternoon to talk specifically about how offering ourselves as a kind-hearted presence in a world that keeps getting more and more divided can be a courageous act of peace. So 14 years ago, my family, including at the time our three very young children, moved from our farmhouse out sort of in the middle of nowhere into the neighborhood here in Goshen, Indiana. Since then, I have written 3 books on this topic of living as neighbors, including, as Maddie mentioned, The Ministry of Ordinary Places, and more recently, Start with Hello. Anything I know now about living as neighbors, I learned secondhand from my courageous neighbors who changed my life slowly and then all at once, particularly in the wave of uncertainty that gripped so many of us in this area and around the country in 2016. My neighborhood is a mashup of worlds. I like to think of my neighborhood as abundant in the truest sense of the word, meaning when we talk about abundance, when we talk about the abundance of God, the idea of living the abundant life, what it means in its essence is not that we just get, quote, the good things, but that we get everything. We are an abundant neighborhood. We are ethnically, culturally, and politically diverse. We are a community rich with immigrants. We are mostly working class people trying to just get through the day with a little bit of softness whenever possible. 1 year ago, exactly 1 year ago, I was running for a seat on Goshen City Council right here in District 3, the only true swing district in all of the city. Over years of building relationships with my neighbors and a season of endless door knocking and really tough conversations, I've become convinced that we all want a good life, even when we might not agree exactly on how to read the map that gets us there. Today, I want to share 3 things that I've learned about courageously living together as neighbors, particularly in times of division. And to be honest, it was a little tricky to narrow it down to 3, but I think these might be the top 3. So the first one I want to talk about is the idea of esteeming difference. There's a lot of conversation happening and has been happening for a while around the ideas of diversity, those types of ideas of including people from different perspectives. And what I'm here to say is it's not just about, tolerating difference. It's not even just about looking for diversity or difference. We're called to esteem difference. Living as courageous neighbors means that we pursue beauty in difference rather than in reflections of ourselves. Diversity is something that we should be treasuring and valuing and seeking out. Difference is an asset to my particular neighborhood and community. And when we think about it, as Maddie also mentioned, I work as a cook in a local neighborhood kitchen, soup kitchen type of facility called The Window. You're all invited to lunch anytime. When we think about our different communities, when we think about just the world that we live in, nobody's very interested in a song made of just one note or in a recipe made of just one ingredient. We understand that as things get a little more complex, the flavor builds. We should be looking for that difference and coming to really require it and value it in the communities we're in, because homogeny is actually bred into so many of our daily routines. From where we choose to live, the way our neighborhoods are set up, the people that we are surrounded by, even at our biological core, we are in some ways conditioned to seek what is familiar and to slowly inch away from anything that might seem unfamiliar or uncomfortable. Though we were never intended to be fearing other people in this way, we have come to sort of fear the other. That's something we have to intentionally fight for, to fight for this abundant community where there is a place for every single one of us. My husband, Corey, is actually the chaplain of the Elkhart County Jail. And that, as you can imagine, bleeds beautifully into almost every corner of our lives. Now, for the past year or year and a half, on Sunday mornings, we host a Bible study with around 50 men and women from the local neighborhood work release center, just a couple of blocks from my house. We've named our group the Holy Alliance, which borrows the theological language from Karen Gonzalez's beautiful book, The God Who Sees. We came to rely on that name, the Holy Alliance, because we really are taken by the idea that neighbors are not just for each other, we are with each other. We are a holy alliance of people with each other, just as Jesus modeled in the incarnation. Being with each other means, of course, proximity. It means we share donuts every morning. Sharing food is a really beautiful way to be with each other. We're with each other in all of our differences, allowing our different notes to blend, learning from each other. Corey is particularly interested in not thinking of himself as the leader of the group. He's always trying to find any opportunity he has to, we don't have a microphone, but to hypothetically pass the mic to other people, to include people, and to ultimately create a space where we are learning from each other rather than just one person or two people teaching the others. We really believe that we have a lot to learn from these incarcerated men and women who continue always and have for the past 10 years discipled us. Being part of a holy alliance means that we actually prioritize each other. We prioritize anyone that we might think of at first glance as being the other, as being different in some way from us. The best example I can think of when I imagine or think back on how have I learned this from the people around me, I always return to one particular story. And this happened years ago. We've lived here for about 14 years now. This happened probably, I don't know, 3 or 4 years into living in this neighborhood. And since the time that we lived here, our next door neighbors has been the same consistent family. So we've both been here for the same duration of time. And slowly over time, we were building a relationship with ourselves and our next door neighbors. Our kids were playing together often. They became best friends through their childhood. With the adults, it's always a little bit harder. And slowly we just let it be slow. We trusted that nothing was ever wasted. We found opportunities here and there to rely on each other, to be together, to not let, our language barrier hold us back, to not let us creep away from each other in our differences, but to continue moving towards each other. Every year, especially when our kids are all just growing up, that's just something that continues to happen to all of us. When the kids were younger, they began inviting us to their birthday parties. And for one of their daughter's birthdays, we were invited into their home. It was during the winter months. And so rather than having, a cookout outside, we were all in the basement of their home. My family was the only family there who happened to not speak Spanish as their first language. And not only do we not speak Spanish as our first language, we just don't really speak Spanish much at all, especially then. I'm relying on just little bits and pieces of my high school Spanish, and that did not get me far. And so Corey and I embraced the awkwardness of being the only people in the room who didn't quite know what was going on, who couldn't really communicate effectively with the people around us. That is an uncomfortable place to be. And it's a very important place to be because it just doesn't happen a lot to people like myself and Corey. This is a newer experience. And so, we just started eating. We did our best to cobble together conversation. We just joined in. Towards the end of the birthday party, we all went up to the kitchen and it was time for them to bring the cake out for their daughter. And I got the distinct feeling, conversation started bubbling up around me in Spanish. I got the distinct feeling that maybe they were talking about us. That's something that you can just kind of pick up on. And, this chatter was happening. I couldn't understand what was being said. They lit the candles on their daughter's birthday cake and sort of made eye contact with each other around the room. And they started singing happy birthday in English. And they did this so that my husband and I could participate. They took a moment out of their daughter's birthday party and sang the song that they would not have probably sung in the language that we would have sung it in. This was a profound example of what it means to prioritize difference, to prioritize the other, to think for our neighbor before we think of ourselves. It's difficult for me to tell that story every time without getting a little teary-eyed because it was just such a beautiful example. The next thing I want to talk about when we think of courageous community is the concept of learning to be too sensitive. Not avoiding being too sensitive, learning to be, conditioning ourselves over time to be too sensitive. Living as courageous neighbors means greeting the world with our hearts exposed and our guards down. I grew up believing and being taught the American values of rugged independence, of telling it like it is, of building wealth and showing strength and deferring to power. I don't know that these were always even words that were spoken, but this was the culture that I was immersed in, and this is what I took from it. Midstream in adulthood, as I, right here in this home, in this neighborhood, found myself propped up by the people around me, people that I wouldn't have always expected to be bolstering me. I realized that these values of strength are actually barriers to the vulnerability that community, real, authentic community requires. Christians, we are taught as we read scripture, as we inspect for our entire lives the life of Jesus, our values are quite different than these values that many of us have come to sort of adopt or embrace. We think of mutual interdependence. We think of empathy and equity and radical generosity. A few years ago, after my family moved into this community, knowing, when we arrived here, I didn't know anybody. I had 3 tiny children. Not all of them were even in school yet. We had moved into this sort of complicated, complex, abundant neighborhood and community. And as I was just getting my bearings, just sort of trying to make it through long days with small children, trying to balance my work, trying to combat the loneliness that I now felt being in a place where I didn't really know a lot of other people. In the midst of all those things happening, in the midst of life, ordinary life, a campaign was started to change the public school mascot from one that had been, for its history, culturally appropriating and problematic and offensive, and to change that problematic mascot to Red Hawks. I was surprised by the fallout, if I'm being honest. I was surprised by the number of people saying, everyone has become too PC. That was a catchphrase I just remember hearing. We're all just too PC, too politically correct. And the even more popular, people just need to grow a thicker skin. Those were ideas that were very familiar to me from my own upbringing. But now the conversation for me had become more personal. Now I was sort of at the fringes of this wider conversation happening around me. And it was curious for me to understand why this was such a big deal to people. The author Clint Smith, and I'm paraphrasing here, he describes history as what people need to know and nostalgia as what people want to hear. And that's from his astonishing, amazing book, How the Word is Passed. And I found myself, though I didn't quite have the context at that time, I mean, this was years ago. I've learned a lot, I've grown a lot. I didn't have the context for understanding why this was so fraught. There was a part of me that just felt like, couldn't we just defer to even what the minority might want? If people are saying, you know, this is hurtful, this is a problem, couldn't we just do that? Couldn't we just set our own ideas of nostalgia aside and let history speak, let the neighbors be heard? As someone who myself had graduated from a high school with a very similar problematic mascot, this was a time of deep learning for me. And as I reflect back on it, it's almost impossible, honestly, to imagine how little I said. I was not actively engaged in the conversation. I was quietly listening, which was exactly what I needed to be doing. I did not need to be inserting myself into this complicated, complex conversation. I needed to be listening because I was in the process of learning and listening my way out of my desensitization. I was learning my way into the idea of being sensitive for the sake of the people around me. As we know, if we're not all flourishing, none of us is flourishing. I was forced to see that my fears of appearing weak, my fears of damaging my reputation, maybe with the people around me or in my life's history who value toughness, those fears were actually causing me to hurt people, to hurt real people. And now suddenly to hurt people who I knew and who I loved and who loved me back. I realized then, and again, I continue to realize slowly over the pull of time, that defaulting to being sensitive to the feelings of others robs me of nothing. Even when I don't always completely understand, even when I fear getting things wrong, we won't always get it right. But I've come to see that it is a true honor to keep trying for each other. Our cultural admiration of telling it like it is has become a cover, and honestly, has maybe always been a cover for prioritizing our own desires and for simply being mean. And this is harming all of us. We are allowed, and in fact, we should expect more from ourselves, from the people around us, from our faith communities, and our leaders. Do we believe I'm looking at the date, on September 25th, 2024, do we believe it is possible to lead with authority and sensitivity? We do if we believe in Jesus. We see that combination infused in the life of Jesus. We can choose to be too sensitive for the sake of each other. We can choose to set our default to the comfort and safety of the people with the least amount of power. And we can believe that this is an act of courageous generosity. Our reward for working our way toward a thinner skin will ultimately be communion. It will be connection. It will be a community that sustains us through everything life throws at us. Finally, when we think of living courageously together, one of the most important lessons that I have learned and that I continue to learn is the miracle, the magic of sticking around, even and especially when life gets boring or hard. Living as courageous neighbors means recognizing that staying put is our love song for the long haul. This is the song that we can sing, and we can keep on singing it. This idea of rootedness is a privilege in many ways. We don't always get to decide where we live or how long we're going to be there. We don't always get to decide for ourselves when we will go and when we will stay. But what I do know for sure is we can decide today, if we have not already, that wherever we happen to be right now, wherever we are, until we are told to go, we will plan to stay. In a fast-paced culture full of success-driving digital nomads and the fear of just simply being ordinary, I think that's something a lot of us fear more than we have maybe even admitted to ourselves, this idea of being ordinary, rather than being driven to upward mobility, that definition of success, that very narrow definition of success, in a world where many of us can live and work from wherever we would like to live. Staying put can be a curious and therefore a courageous choice. Right here in my abundant neighborhood, where you will find a little bit of everything, many of us are gardeners. Now, a little note on that. I was part of a neighborhood meeting. This was several years ago before the pandemic. And these were leaders from different facets of the broader community and even countywide coming together to decide, in essence, what should we do with that neighborhood? And that neighborhood meaning my neighborhood, our neighborhood. This is a lower income neighborhood. This is a neighborhood that many people would not necessarily choose. This is a neighborhood that if people were being honest, and I hope we always are, they would describe as being on the wrong side of the tracks. And so here we were in these prolonged, it was a long series of meetings to sort of figure out how this neighborhood could be bettered in some way or helped. Curiously, throughout the course of those meetings, I was the only person invited to the meetings who actually lives in this neighborhood. And I found that very interesting. And it's a point that I raised maybe a few times too many because it started to wear some people down. In one of those meetings, a couple of the leaders, we were kind of tossing out ideas about what this neighborhood already has and what this neighborhood could use. We were working, at least hypothetically, from the ABCD model, asset-based community development, which is a wonderful model for looking at our neighborhoods, no matter where they are. And so after considering the assets of the neighborhood, which is where it should always begin, we were having conversations about what might be added in. And one of these leaders said, with care and kindness, honestly, the idea that this person had was to maybe plant flowers throughout my neighborhood. And I sat there and I thought, have you ever been to my neighborhood? Because I am walking in my neighborhood all the time. Taking walks in my neighborhood is one of the most spiritually formative practices of my entire life. And I mean that very seriously. And I've written about it a lot. But when I'm out on walks in my neighborhood, one of the things I've become very sure of is that in the scheme of things that unite us, and in the scheme of things we might have in similarity, despite our differences over here, one thing we really seem to have in common is that many of us are gardeners. And my little feeble attempts at gardening pale in comparison to the gardens many of my neighbors grow season after season after season, bringing in things that I didn't even know could grow in northern Indiana. In the last week alone, my neighbors have brought me, and I had fun making this list. They brought me habanero peppers that nobody in this house could possibly eat. I can handle a little bit of spice, but I don't think I can handle that spice level. And I have learned to receive anything that is given to me in generosity, because hospitality and generosity means that we don't just get to be the one giving, we get to be the one receiving. And so when my neighbor offered me habanero peppers, I received them with gratitude and with love. Not only did I get the spicy peppers, I received honey figs. This was an item that is new to me. This is something I did not know. That falls under the category of I did not know that could grow here. One perfect pink brandywine tomato, 2 butternut squashes, and 3 little pumpkins. And that is just in the past week. Everything given to me was and is the kindness of Christ passed between us. My particular, in its season of fading right now at the end of September, my little alley side garden continuously preaches to me a 4-point sermon. And that is, number 1, grow roots. As I watch my garden grow, I am reminded of the vital part of letting my roots sink into this soil for as long as I'm here. And I honestly hope it's mostly forever. And I just don't have control over that. But for as long as I'm here, I hope I am continually watering my roots and letting them grow deeper and deeper into the soil of belonging and courageous community. Number 2, be patient for a very long time through all kinds of weather. That is a lesson a garden is ready to teach us, that this is slow work. Like I said before, it is allowed to be slow. It is allowed to be bumbling and awkward. We can truly believe that every little inch we make towards each other, every little inroad, every time we go first in generosity and vulnerability and just making an invitation and saying yes and showing up, every move we make is for our flourishing, our collective flourishing, and our growth. And we do this through celebration, like my neighbor's birthday party. And we do this through suffering. Like when my neighbor behind the alley was recently in a very terrible, terrible car accident. And we came together to support each other, all kinds of weather. Number 3, what my garden teaches me about growing community and connection is to commit without expectation. Any of you who are gardeners learn this over and over and over. I plant a variety of things every year. I'm not particularly good, to my dad's pain. I don't really know what I'm doing, and I don't really put the amount of effort into it that my dad does and that others do. I just like to watch things grow. And so I grow a variety of seeds, and every year without exception, a lot of it grows and some of it doesn't. Some years are better for tomatoes and worse for cucumbers. Some years are not great for peppers. Some years the beets are gobbled up before they can even really grow. I make the commitment to show up and to plant without expectation of what will happen next. And finally, the 4th thing my garden shows me every year, and not just my garden, but the gardens surrounding me, this big garden that we live in together, is to hope to be surprised. To carry hope and expectation is no small thing in this world that we live in. The prophet Jeremiah puts it like this in Jeremiah chapter 29, build homes and plan to stay. As Majora Carter, a friend of mine, who is an urban revitalization strategist from the Bronx, echoes, you don't have to leave your neighborhood to live in a better one. As the passage in Jeremiah sort of wraps up, work for the peace and prosperity of the city where I sent you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, for its welfare determines your welfare. wherever we find ourselves, wherever we are today. The welfare of the people around us determines our welfare. If my neighbors are not safe and held and loved, I am also not safe, and I am also lacking in love. The stakes have never been higher for carving a path through all of our difference and all of our division. And you cannot live 1 hour right now without hearing it and seeing it and knowing it in your bones. Our neighborhoods and communities are pulsing with possibility. Our places are ripe for repair. As we root courageously into our communities, seeking opportunities to experience one another as true image bearers, no matter what, full stop. As we find solidarity and as we experience empathy together, we will find that collective flourishing. We will move closer into the kingdom of God happening right now. One of the things we talk about at Holy Alliance often is the idea that we shouldn't have to die before we are experiencing at least a portion of the community, the kingdom of God. And so as we work courageously towards each other, we get a taste of that. As we esteem difference and let ourselves grow too sensitive for the sake of each other, as we stick around through it all, connection grows and our bonds are strengthened. Despite all of our fears of each other, our fears of difference, we actually become safer as we move closer to each other. We can bring our walls down. We can reach out and trust. We're not just happier when we are with the people around us, we are safer. Making one little neighborhood, one little community more connected makes the world more connected. That math always checks out. It is going to take courage to fight for each other, to fight for us, a collective, a community, a communion. But that fight, that courageous fight, is ultimately what will free us through the power of God and the example of Jesus. In the words of the phenomenal author, Cole Arthur Riley, liberation is for those who tremble. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Shannan. That was fantastic. I feel like I was trying to just like quickly write down so many quotes. So like I want all to save all of this. But we're gonna transition now to a time of answering some of your questions from the audience. So feel free to go ahead and add those to the chat. But I wanted to go ahead and start off with one question that I was thinking about as you were talking in the beginning. I love this idea of esteeming difference and not just tolerating difference.
Yeah.
But I'm curious if, I think there's a trend right now, and it's so easy to do, is like we just don't talk about difference, or we don't talk about disagreement, or we don't talk about our struggles, or like what's really hard for our family because it might cause conflict. So
Yeah.
my question is like, how do you respond when you are dealing with the conflict, or when that conflict does come up? Because I think the thing about living in a community is like, as neighbors, you do rub up against each other. Like that is gonna happen.
Yeah. And thank God that I cannot understate enough the way I have been changed by my neighbors. And I mean, I'm kind of repeating myself at this point, but learning to live, up to the point of living in this neighborhood, I had lived a very homogenous life. And at the point that I was immersed in difference, I just had so much to learn. And, I am forever, it is God's grace to me that I was allowed to rub up against difference in that way. One of the things that is helpful to me, especially when I'm encountering difference that is really frustrating to me, difference that even angers me, And it's a little, it's humbling every time. I feel the Holy Spirit reminding me that people actually can change, and that I am my own example. I am my own example of people really being capable of dramatic change, even later in life. And so, even as I was out canvassing for the city council seat that I ultimately lost, by the way, I did not win that election. And so I was kind of forced to gather up everything I learned from that process and decide, okay, I tried that and it's not for me right now. And so what do I do with what I've learned? Encountering people right in my neighborhood who see the world differently in some ways than I do, it's hopeful for me to remember that as we continue to move towards each other, like you said, Maddie, like rubbing shoulders against each other, we are bound to change in some small way, and sometimes in bigger ways. And sometimes it just takes time. And I want to be careful to say I'm not suggesting that dangerous behavior, belief and behavior that is really harmful to people, I'm not excusing that. And I don't want to give any sort of trite statements that should be condoned. I think we have to be people of wisdom, people who are discerning when to move closer and when to maybe take a step back. I think all of this is kind of wrapped into that bigger conversation. But I guess the thing I would hold on to and offer each of you is just the memory of the ways each of us have changed, and allowing that to carry us in hope towards each other, and particularly towards the people who we might find a bit vexing right now for whatever reason.
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. Jay has this great question of, have you ever experienced a mistrustful neighbor that did not draw near to you in response to your neighboring efforts?
Yes.
And yeah, what was your response to that?
I mean, for sure, in the abundance of any community or neighborhood, I have learned, and by the way, everything I say today, I say as a deep and true introvert. And so none of this comes particularly easily for me. And I'm always, even 14 years in, I'm fighting against kind of my hardwired impulses in some way. But I have learned through trial and error that being a good neighbor to some people means leaving them alone, like giving people space when they need space, not making someone intentionally uncomfortable or inserting my life too much in their life. I am always going to smile and say hello and give a wave if I see you. But I just know for sure that not everybody feels that way. And so honoring that and esteeming that is something that I can do for that neighbor. Now, I do have one story about that. There's a man who actually passed away just a little over a year ago, lived directly across the street from us. And he was kind of one of those people that I would have seen almost maybe unfairly as maybe kind of a crankier neighbor. He was one of those that I was like, okay, he just wants to be left alone, and I'm going to honor that. And every year, the one thing that we did do was at Christmas time, especially when our kids were younger, we would take, Christmas treats around to our nearest neighbors, and we would always leave him some treats. And usually he didn't even answer the door. We would leave them on the stoop or whatever. And the Christmas before he passed away, on Christmas Eve, we get a knock on our door, and it is him. His name was Dean. And I was shocked to see him. He had never, ever come to our door. And he handed me a grocery bag with 4 oranges in it. And he handed it to me and said, "Merry Christmas. This year I have something for you." And that was, that is the deepest we ever got. There was that moment in time where I felt like, again, my only job was to receive what he brought. But it's an example of what we just talked about. Like, over time, we are rubbing off on each other in small ways. We are changing each other in small ways.
Yeah, wow. That's such a good story. This other question I want to talk through with you is from Rachel Anderson about sometimes the work of parenting and other types of caregiving can draw us inward rather than outward. Did you
Yeah.
experience this when your children were young? How were you intentional about overcoming
I experience it every day. My impulse is always to draw inward. And the only thing that has helped me is the true bodily, like almost biological belief that I now have that I have never walked away from engaging or connecting. Anytime I've intentionally moved towards somebody, even if it didn't go as planned, even if it wasn't sort of, what we think of as a success, I've never walked away feeling like, wow, that was a huge waste of time, or wow, that ruined my life. So even when it doesn't always go quite the way we wanted it to, but most times I walk away feeling so glad that I did it. And so when I'm in times of sort of lower capacity for whatever reason, and yeah, having young kids, in some ways I felt like having young kids made it easier because my kids were just like, kids just don't care. They're just here for the fun. They don't care if you don't speak the same language. Like, they just want to run around and get sweaty with you. And so my kids were a great example of that for us. And getting involved in PTO, spending time around their schools, those were really natural inroads into me kind of learning my community. But in other ways, yes, having small children, and especially like I had a wild child, and anyone here with kids probably knows what I mean by that. And so having a wild child in particular just made it challenging to think of inviting people over, or just, thinking straight just made things hard for a while. And so whatever the reason is, when capacity is lower, looking for those small little ways to connect and trusting that it is enough. Going for walks in the neighborhood, hanging out in the front yard instead of the backyard. Sometimes that is all we can muster. And over time, we kind of learn the patterns of our place. I wrote in Start with Hello a very similar story where for over a year, I kept seeing the same person. And slowly over time, I said hello. Slowly over time, we stopped and kind of started to chit chat. And then, like I ended up in the kitchen of this new friend. She invited me into her space, and we're not best friends forever now, but we sure are neighbors. And it just was very, very slow. So I guess, taking the pressure off, this isn't about having a to-do list. It's not about doing something to make our neighbors' lives better. It's really for the benefit of ourselves and for our collective connection, and living a life where we feel like we are known and loved by the people closest to us. It's just, I don't know that it is the path to the good life. And that doesn't mean that hard things are not going to still happen, but it means when hard things happen, the people physically closest to us at least know who we are. So finding those, I'm somebody who's always going to kind of shut it down and close the door and turn off the lights and just give me my book. But when I feel a little bit of capacity, when I'm paying attention out in the world and seeing an opportunity, being a little faster to take that opportunity, putting myself out there just a little bit more, has always borne fruit. Always.
Yeah, that's so great. Such a good answer. And I want to just repeat what Rachel Anderson just put in the chat box, which is presence, not perfection.
Yes.
And
Yep.
yeah,
Just doing it, just doing the work, showing up, staying put in that work. I remember thinking when I had little kids, and this is probably still true, maybe even truer now that I have teenagers. I just felt like I spent most of my life between my kitchen island and my kitchen sink. Like, that's just where I lived.
yeah,
That is where I lived. That's where I felt like I was going to die. Like, it was hard to imagine my life outside of, my minivan or my kitchen. And so we're always kind of moving through these seasons. And yet, if we're paying attention, there are opportunities that kind of bubble up.
yeah. Yeah, and I think that you talked about the process of making ourselves sensitive, which I really like. Like that's not just an automatic setting within us, but something we
Yeah.
become. And I think that's one of the things, like how can you become sensitive to someone when you're not there, like with it or seeing
Yeah.
it or witnessing it? And so I love that presence because I think we're sometimes, especially myself as I work as an advocate and think about advocacy all the time, there is this idea of the perfect advocate and like all
Yeah.
those things where it's just like, where do you just show up?
Yes.
What if you just do what you can do? It really is enough.
Right. Right. Yep.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna let our questions go a little long because I think these are really good questions. But Galen put in, what wisdom would you offer to those who move from place to place and have a limited time horizon for connecting with neighbors? And he gave a great
Yeah.
example of like Jesus was one of those people that moved around
Yeah.
a lot.
Yeah. I have a good friend she's also an author. Her name is Bree McCoy. She's she's written a book, like a nonfiction book, a trade book, and then also a cookbook. So she's a foodie. And her husband is in the military. And they don't have children, but their family moves every couple of years. I mean, that's just the rhythm of their life. And she's really kind of opened my eyes to, it's that idea that if something doesn't work for everybody, then it just doesn't really work. And so this idea of staying put, how does that work for somebody like Bree, who she's told every couple of years where she's moving? And I mean, I've kind of charted their movement, and it's not like these are like from coast to coast to coast, like they are big moves. She's written so well about the intention that she has learned to put into the idea of, for as long as I'm here, I plan to stay. Like really stay, like learn my place, get to know the people around me. Because in the scheme of life, like we don't want to look back and feel like we never really experienced community because we only had 2 years at a time. 2 years is 2 years. 2 months is 2 months. I don't want to go through a full day without connecting meaningfully with somebody. And so she has just kind of found a rhythm of acceptance and even kind of adventure in the life that they're living right now. And she puts just a lot of intention behind it. And so I think if we can kind of break out of our ideas behind what it looks like, staying put is not so much a timeline as it is an intention. And just trying to make use of the time that we have while we have it.
Okay, for our final question, they said, when you found yourself in situations of awkwardness, such as the birthday party, and I'm sure you've been in others, did you have practices that helped you lean into those situations and be present? Breathing, certain prayers, or images that you held in mind?
I wish I was the type of person that had like a particular prayer or like a really spiritual image that I could fall back on in times of awkwardness. The reality is, I think I'm the most awkward person in the world. And what I've learned is we all kind of feel that way. That's something that we have in common. We all think we're the worst or, we're the most or whatever. And when I think back to Andrea's birthday party, it was very helpful for me to remember how often my neighbors were the ones in that position. My neighbors tend to be the ones who are feeling that tension of maybe not being able to understand or not being able to communicate as they would like. My neighbors are the ones who have taught me to fumble terribly through trying to speak Spanish with them, even though it's embarrassing. I'm bad at it. But I've learned from them that the vulnerability that requires is a real building block towards lasting community as I watch them practice their English with me. So I think remembering that awkwardness is inevitable. I wrote about awkwardness a good bit in this book because I wish I had a solution for it. I mean, I wish I could solve relational awkwardness, personal awkwardness. I wish one of you would solve it for me. Until then, all I can tell all of us is it is inevitable and it is survivable. We are going to get through that awkward moment. I mean, I think awkwardness might be the thing that holds me back the most, the fear of awkwardness, the fear of, I mean, we can think of a million examples in our minds. Just the very simple awkwardness of feeling like, okay, I hear you, Shannan, but I've lived here for 15 years. How do I go? Like, I should know my next door neighbors' names and I don't. How do you go to them and say, we've been here together for 15 years and we've never met? Like, that feels really awkward. And so that feeling of awkwardness might be what holds us back. But going back to Rachel's point, presence, not perfection. The thing that is maybe the most helpful for me is imagining myself on the other side of the equation. So if I imagine myself in my home and that neighbor comes to me and knocks on my door and says, hey, we've lived here for a long time. We should officially meet each other. It's been way too long. There's nothing in me that feels like, wow, that was dumb. No, I feel grateful. I feel honored. I feel like, okay, it's okay to be awkward together. So anytime I have that fear of, when I feel that fear of awkwardness holding me back from connection, I try to imagine myself on the other side of it, and it always pushes me through.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much, Shannan. This has been so wonderful. I really appreciate everything you had to share today. And we're just really grateful for you. In the follow-up email, we will send some links to where you can access her books that she's written and some of the writing that she has, because I'm sure all of us would appreciate being able to follow along with the work that you are doing.
Thank you all. Thank you all for being here. It's an honor.
And coming out of that conversation, I think all of us are wondering, like, what does it look like for us to be sensitive to our neighbors and our communities? And one way that we get to be sensitive to our neighbors is to care about the policies that impact them, to care about the very real economic financial burdens that are placed on them, to care about school systems and districts that are around them. And one practical tool the Center for Public Justice has that could be helpful for this is political discipleship. So the Center for Public Justice has a guide called Political Discipleship that's created for small groups, and it helps provide a practical approach to Christian citizenship and engagement with public justice. It really helps empower groups with the necessary skills and tools to address inequality in their neighborhoods, and to look at injustice that they're seeing, that their neighbors are experiencing, and care about it. Because like Shannan said, like, we cannot flourish when our communities are not flourishing. When our neighbors are not flourishing, we cannot flourish. And so how do we picture that kingdom of God where we're all able to flourish together, and start envisioning that now? So political discipleship offers a time to gather your friends, neighbors, or a church small group and prayerfully discern how you can love your neighbor through politics. So we just dropped the link to that in the chat. Feel free to access that. We will also send another link to it in our follow-up email. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. I just wanted to share really quickly about 2 potential advocacy opportunities that Families Value has right now. One, we are currently collecting stories about how the child tax credit has improved the lives of families. So if the child tax credit has helped your family, whether that be economically, relationally, and all the different ways that having an additional money can come in when you have children can help, you'd be willing to share about that, even if it's just a few sentences, please drop your name and email in the chat, and we will reach out to you to find out about that information. And secondly, if you are based in Texas or North Carolina and have an interest in engaging in advocacy around paid family leave, would you also just drop a comment real quick in the chat that has your email address and which state you're located in, and we can reach out about ways that you can be more engaged in advocacy there. And then finally, if you would like to learn more about Families Valued, you can subscribe to the Families Valued newsletter to get monthly updates on family supportive policy, advocacy opportunities, stories of encouragement, and other ways to get involved with the Center for Public Justice. We'll have access to that link in our follow-up email. But thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you again to Shannan. Really appreciate the work you had to share with us. All of the resources that were mentioned will be shared in our follow-up email, as well as a recording of this event. So feel free to share that with your friends and family. But we really look forward to seeing you on our next community call in December. Thank you all.